The raindrops tapped against the window like gentle fingers as Annie sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at her brother Tom's laptop screen. She borrowed it to work on her history project, but what she found instead made her stomach twist into knots. There, in plain sight, was a series of messages between Tom and their stepmom Rose that shouldn't exist. Annie's hands trembled as she scrolled through the conversations. At first, she tried to convince herself she was misunderstanding things. Maybe this was just some weird joke or a misunderstanding. But as she read more, the reality became impossible to deny. The messages became more frequent about 6 months after Rose had married their dad. The house felt different now, like every shadow held a secret. Annie could hear Rose downstairs, humming while preparing dinner, acting like everything was normal. The same Rose who had brought them homemade cookies on her first visit, who had promised to be a supportive addition to their family when she married their dad last year. Annie's mind raced back to all the small moments she'd dismissed, the lingering looks during family dinners, the coincidental encounters in the hallway, the way Tom had become increasingly withdrawn over the past months. It all made sense now in the worst possible way. Her brother had always been the confident one, captain of the debate team, always ready with a quick joke or a helping hand. But lately he'd been different, quieter, jumpier, spending more time alone in his room. Annie had chalked it up to senior year stress, but now she heard footsteps coming up the stairs and quickly switched to her history assignment tab. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure anyone could hear it. Rose's voice called out, "Kids, dinner in 20 minutes." The normalcy of the announcement felt like a mockery. Annie looked at the family photo on her desk, taken just last Christmas. Everyone was smiling, including their dad, who looked happier than he had in years after meeting Rose. He worked long hours at the hospital, trusting Rose to take care of his family. The thought made Annie's chest ache. What was she supposed to do with this information? Tell their dad? Confront Tom? Confront Rose? Every option seemed impossible, each potential outcome more devastating than the last. She closed the laptop carefully, as if it might explode if handled too roughly. The sound of Tom's car pulling into the driveway made her jump. He'd been at debate team practice, or at least that's what he'd said. Annie moved to her window, watching him walk toward the house. His shoulders were hunched, nothing like the confident stride he used to have. She noticed how he hesitated slightly before opening the front door. The smell of Rose's signature lasagna wafted up the stairs. The same recipe that had once made Annie so happy, thinking they were finally becoming a real family again after Mom's death. Now the scent made her feel sick. She heard Tom's footsteps in the hallway, then the sound of his bedroom door closing. Annie sat there, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her shoulders. She was only 16. How was she supposed to handle something like this? The rain continued its steady rhythm against her window, a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. One thing was certain, nothing in their house would ever be the same again. The sound of her dad's car returning from his hospital shift added another layer of complexity to her turmoil. She could hear his tired but cheerful greeting downstairs, the normal sounds of their family evening routine continuing as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Annie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Tomorrow, she would have to face Tom, look into his eyes knowing what she knew. She would have to sit across from Rose at breakfast, watch her act like the perfect stepmom while hiding such a dark secret. But tonight, she just had to get through dinner without falling apart. As she heard her name being called for dinner, Annie stood up slowly, her legs feeling like lead. She caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked exactly the same as she had this morning, but she felt decades older. With one last glance at the laptop that had changed everything, she opened her door and stepped into the hallway, into a house full of secrets that threatened to tear her family apart. 3 days passed before Annie found the courage to talk to Tom. 3 days of awkward dinners, fake smiles, and sleepless nights. She caught him alone one afternoon when Rose was at her book club and their dad was working another long shift at the hospital. Tom was in the backyard, absently bouncing a basketball he hadn't properly played with in months. Annie watched him through the kitchen window for a moment, remembering how he used to practice for hours, dreaming of making the school team. That felt like a lifetime ago now. "Can we talk?" Annie's voice cracked slightly as she stepped onto the back porch. Tom caught the ball and held it, not turning to face her. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of their neighbor's apple pie. About what? His voice was flat, but Annie could see the tension in his shoulders. I borrowed your laptop the other day, she started, her heart pounding, for my history project. The basketball slipped from Tom's hands, bouncing away across the yard. He still didn't turn around. You had no right to look through my stuff. His voice was barely above a whisper, but Annie could hear the mix of anger and fear in it. I wasn't looking through anything, she said, taking a step closer. The messages were just there. Tom, what's going on? How long has this been happening? Finally, he turned to face her. Annie's heart broke when she saw his eyes. They looked so lost, so different from her confident big brother who used to chase away her nightmares and help her with math homework. You don't understand, he said, running a hand through his hair. It's not what you think. Rose, she said she really cares about me. She said we have a special connection. Annie felt sick. Tom, that's not right. She's married to Dad. She's our stepmom. You think I don't know that? Tom's voice cracked. He sank down onto the old wooden bench that Dad had built years ago. It started with little things. She'd compliment me, touch my shoulder when no one was looking. Then the messages started. She said she'd never met anyone as mature as me, that I understood her in ways Dad never could. Annie sat beside him, careful to leave some space between them. The bench creaked under their weight, a sound that used to make them giggle during summer evenings spent eating popsicles. Now it just felt hollow. Why didn't you tell anyone? Annie asked softly. Tom laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Tell who? Dad. He's finally happy again after Mom died. And Rose, she said nobody would believe me anyway. Said I'd been flirting with her, that I'd started it. Sometimes I wonder if maybe she's right. No, Annie said firmly, grabbing his hand. This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. She's the adult. She's supposed to protect us, not this. Tom pulled his hand away, standing up abruptly. You can't tell anyone, Annie. Promise me. It would destroy Dad. And maybe things will get better. Rose says once I'm in college. Stop, Annie interrupted. Listen to yourself. This isn't love, Tom. She's manipulating you. Remember when Jenny from your debate team started dating that college guy who kept telling her to keep their relationship secret? You're the one who told her that wasn't right. Tears started rolling down Tom's cheeks. It's different, he whispered, but Annie could hear the uncertainty in his voice. It's not different, she said, standing up too. You're my brother, Tom. My brilliant, kind, amazing brother. And what she's doing, it's wrong. It's so wrong. The sound of a car pulling into their driveway made them both freeze. Rose was home early. Tom quickly wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Please, Annie, he begged. Don't say anything. Not yet. I need time to think. Annie watched as he hurried inside, leaving the basketball forgotten in the yard. She could hear Rose's cheerful greeting, the sound of grocery bags being set on the kitchen counter. Everything seeming so normal while their world was falling apart. Picking up the basketball, Annie held it tight against her chest. The weight of her brother's secret felt even heavier now. She knew she couldn't stay quiet forever, not when someone was hurting her brother. But for now, she would give him what he asked for: time. As she walked back inside, Annie made a silent promise to herself and to Tom. She would find a way to help him, to make this right. Because that's what family does, real family, not the fake version Rose was trying to create. They protect each other, no matter what. The next 2 weeks at home felt like walking on eggshells. Every creak of the floorboards, every closed door, every whispered conversation carried new meaning. Annie watched as Rose's perfect stepmom facade began to crack under the weight of suspicion. At breakfast, Rose's hand lingered too long on Tom's shoulder as she served pancakes. Annie caught the slight flinch her brother tried to hide, the way his fork pushed food around his plate without ever reaching his mouth. Their dad, buried in his medical journal, remained oblivious to the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I was thinking, Rose announced one morning, her voice honey-sweet, we should take a family trip next weekend. The lake house is beautiful this time of year. Annie's stomach churned. The lake house meant isolation, meant fewer eyes watching, fewer chances for escape. She watched Tom's knuckles turn white around his glass of orange juice. I have a big history project due, Annie said quickly. And Tom has debate team practice, right? Tom nodded gratefully, not meeting Rose's eyes. Yeah, we have regionals coming up. Rose's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Family should come first, don't you think? Your father and I hardly see you kids anymore. Leave them be, Rose, their dad said, finally looking up from his journal. Education's important. We can plan something for the holidays instead. The silence that followed was deafening. Annie could feel Rose's gaze burning into her, knew she suspected something. The perfect stepmom mask slipped for just a second, revealing something darker underneath. Later that day, Annie found her diary moved slightly on her desk. Her phone started having mysterious technical issues, especially when she tried to text Tom. Small things, easily explained away, but the message was clear. Rose was watching. During family movie night, Annie noticed how Rose always managed to sit between her and Tom, how she'd created a subtle barrier. Their dad dozed in his armchair, exhausted from a long surgery, while Rose chatted about her day with calculated cheerfulness. Oh, and I ran into Mrs. Chen at the grocery store, Rose said casually. She mentioned seeing Tom at the park yesterday. Funny, I thought you were at debate practice. Tom's face paled slightly. We finished early. I needed some air. Alone? Rose's voice carried a warning that only Tom and Annie could hear. I was with him, Annie cut in. We got ice cream. It was a lie, but she'd gotten good at those lately. Anything to protect her brother. The corners of Rose's mouth tightened. How nice. You two have gotten so close lately. Almost secretive. Their dad stood in his chair. Everything okay? I thought I heard tension. Everything's fine, honey, Rose said, her voice instantly switching back to sugary sweet. Just catching up on the kids' day. That night, Annie lay awake listening to the house settle. She heard Tom's door open and close softly, followed by footsteps in the hallway. Her heart raced until she heard the bathroom door close, just normal midnight wanderings, not something worse. She'd started keeping a detailed diary of everything she noticed, hiding it inside her old stuffed rabbit, where Rose wouldn't think to look. Every suspicious interaction, every veiled threat, every time Tom's eyes looked a little more haunted. The weight of evidence growing heavier by the day. The next morning, Annie found a college brochure on her desk for a school 3 states away. She hadn't applied there. When she went downstairs, Rose was making coffee. I thought you might be interested, Rose said, sliding a mug across the counter. They have an excellent history program. And sometimes, distance from family can be healthy during college years. The threat was clear: disappear or be disappeared. Annie took the mug with steady hands, meeting Rose's gaze. Thanks, but I think I'll stay closer to home. Family's important, right? A muscle twitched in Rose's jaw. Of course, dear, just keeping your options open. Their standoff was interrupted by Tom coming downstairs. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. Rose immediately switched her attention to him, all concern and caring stepmom. You don't look well, sweetie. Why don't I drive you to school today? I can take him, Annie said quickly. We needed to discuss the history project anyway. Another flash of that cold anger in Rose's eyes, quickly masked. If you're sure. Just looking out for the family. In the car, Tom finally broke down. She knows, he whispered. She knows you know. Annie, I'm scared. Annie gripped the steering wheel tighter. We need to tell someone. A counselor, the police, someone. She'll twist everything around. Make it look like I wanted it. Like I'm crazy. Then we'll find proof. We'll find others. Annie's mind was already working, putting pieces together. You can't have been the first, Tom. People like her. They have patterns. The school appeared ahead, looking so normal it felt wrong. Hundreds of students streaming in, worried about tests and crushes and normal teenage things. Annie invited them. Just be careful, Tom said as they parked. Rose isn't who she pretends to be, and she always gets what she wants. Annie watched her brother walk into school, shoulders hunched, trying to make himself invisible. She pulled out her phone, started a new note. It was time to do some digging into Rose's past. Someone somewhere must know something. The truth would come out. It had to. The only question was, how much damage would Rose do before it did? Annie's investigation into Rose's past started with simple internet searches, but quickly grew into something much bigger. She stayed late after school, using the library computers to avoid leaving traces at home. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Rose had worked at 3 different high schools as a substitute teacher, each job lasting less than a year. She'd moved between cities, changing her last name slightly each time. The pattern was there, hidden beneath the surface of her perfect stepmom image. While printing some documents in the school library, Annie overheard 2 junior boys talking in hushed voices. "Did you see the texts Mrs. Wilson sent Andy? His mom found them and totally freaked out." Annie's heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Wilson, Rose's new teaching job at the neighboring school. She pretended to organize her papers while listening more carefully. "Yeah, he had to change his number," said she kept calling him, saying they had a special connection or something. The same words she used with Tom. Annie's hands shook as she gathered her printouts. This wasn't just about her family anymore. Rose was targeting other students too. During dinner that night, Rose casually mentioned her teaching job. "The boys are so respectful there, much more mature than you'd expect for their age." Annie watched their dad nod absently, focused on his medical charts. Tom stared at his plate, his food untouched. The weight of what Annie had discovered pressed against her chest like a stone. After dinner, she found an excuse to visit the kitchen when Rose was cleaning up. She noticed Rose's phone on the counter, unlocked. Taking a deep breath, Annie pretended to get a glass of water while quickly glancing at the screen. Multiple message threads with young guys' names. Her hands trembled as she took a photo with her own phone, hidden in her pocket. "Finding everything okay?" Rose's voice made her jump. She stood in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel, her eyes sharp despite her pleasant smile. "Just getting water," Annie said, holding up her glass. As she turned to leave, Rose's hand caught her arm. "You know, Annie, I've been thinking about our chat about college. Sometimes people who dig too deep into things that don't concern them find themselves in difficult situations." Annie met her gaze steadily. "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing." That night, Annie couldn't sleep. She laid in bed, scrolling through local news websites on her phone. A pattern emerged. Young men at different schools, rumors of inappropriate relationships, sudden transfers. No names were ever mentioned, but the similarities were striking. A soft knock on her door made her quickly hide her phone. Tom slipped in, looking more anxious than usual. "She's been asking about you," he whispered. "About what you've been doing after school." "Annie, I'm worried." "I found things, Tom. Evidence. She's done this before at other schools, and she's doing it again now." Annie pulled out her phone, showing him the photo of Rose's messages. Tom's face went pale. "There are others? Current ones?" Annie nodded. "A boy named Andy at her new school. Probably more we don't know about. We have to stop her." "But how? Nobody will believe us. It's our word against hers, and she's got Dad wrapped around her finger." Annie pulled out the papers she'd printed. "Not anymore. Look at these. News articles, school records, patterns of behavior. And I found some of her old students on social media. They're willing to talk." Tom sat heavily on her bed. "She'll destroy us. She knows things about me, Annie, things I'm ashamed of." "She knows things because she manipulated you," Annie said firmly. "You're not alone anymore, Tom. And neither are her other victims." The next morning, Annie went to see Mrs. Baker, the school counselor. Her heart pounded as she laid out everything she'd discovered, the pattern of abuse, the multiple victims, the threats. Mrs. Baker listened without interruption, her face growing more serious with each detail. When Annie finished, the counselor was quiet for a long moment. "You did the right thing coming to me," she finally said. "This is bigger than one family or one school. We need to involve the authorities." "Will they believe us?" Annie asked, her voice small. "With the evidence you've gathered? Yes. And Annie, you've probably saved more than just your brother. People like this don't stop unless they're forced to." As Mrs. Baker picked up her phone to make some calls, Annie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The truth was finally coming out. But she also knew the hardest part was still to come, telling their dad. Walking home that afternoon, Annie saw Rose's car in the school parking lot where she taught. She was talking to a young student through the car window. Annie took out her phone and started recording. No more secrets, no more victims. The breaking point had finally come. Whatever happened next would be difficult, but staying silent would be worse. As Annie walked home, she thought about all the lives Rose had damaged, all the families she'd hurt. It ended here. It ended now. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Baker. Police want to talk tomorrow. Bring Tom. You're doing the right thing. Annie looked up at the sky, took a deep breath, and started planning how to tell their dad. The truth would hurt him, but lies had already done worse damage. Sometimes breaking points were necessary for healing to begin. The morning everything changed started like any other. Their dad was making coffee, the morning news playing softly in the background. Rose had left early for a teacher meeting. Annie and Tom exchanged knowing looks across the kitchen table. "Dad," Annie said quietly, "we need to talk to you about something important." He looked up from his medical journal, reading glasses perched on his nose. "Can it wait? I have surgery in 2 hours." "No." Tom spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "It can't wait anymore." Their dad must have heard something in Tom's voice because he closed his journal and took off his glasses. "What's wrong?" Annie pulled out the folder she prepared. Printouts, screenshots, timeline of events. Her hands trembled as she laid them on the table. "It's about Rose, Dad. There's something you need to know." As they began explaining, their dad's face went through a range of emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, devastating realization. When Tom started talking about the messages, the manipulation, their dad's coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "She made me feel like it was my fault," Tom said, tears running down his face. "Like I'd asked for it somehow. And I didn't want to hurt you, Dad. You were finally happy again." Their dad stood up abruptly, pacing the kitchen. "Happy, while my son was being, while my wife was." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm calling the police." "We already did," Annie said softly. "Mrs. Baker, my school counselor, helped us. They want to talk to us today. And Dad, there are others. Other boys at her school." The color drained from their dad's face as he looked at the evidence Annie had gathered. News clippings about Sutton teacher transfers, social media messages from other victims, the pattern spanning years and multiple schools. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm supposed to notice when people are hurting. How did I not see this?" "She was careful," Tom said. "She made sure you were always busy, always distracted. And she threatened to turn everything around, make it look like I started it." The doorbell rang, making them all jump. Through the window, they could see 2 police officers standing on the porch. Annie squeezed Tom's hand under the table. What followed was hours of questions, statements, evidence collection. Their dad called the hospital to cancel his surgeries, his hands shaking as he dialed. More officers arrived, then a detective, then a victim advocate. Around noon, they heard Rose had been arrested at her school. More victims had come forward, current and former students, boys who'd been afraid to speak up. The detective said they'd found similar cases in other states, under different names. Their dad sat in his armchair, looking older than Annie had ever seen him. "I brought her into our home," he kept saying. "I let her near my children." "It's not your fault, Dad," Annie said firmly. "She fooled everyone. She was good at it. But she can't hurt anyone else now." Later that afternoon, reporters started gathering outside their house. The story was breaking. Respected teacher and stepmother arrested, multiple victims, years of abuse. Their phones wouldn't stop ringing. The victim advocate helped them draft a statement, advised them on next steps. There would be court dates, counseling sessions, difficult conversations ahead. But for the first time in months, they could breathe freely in their own home. That evening, the 3 of them sat in the living room, eating takeout pizza because nobody had the energy to cook. The TV was off. They didn't want to see the news coverage. Their dad had already started looking for a family therapist. "I'm proud of you both," he said suddenly, "for being brave enough to speak up, for protecting each other." Tom looked up from his untouched pizza. "I thought you'd be ashamed of me." "Never," their dad said fiercely. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing. I'm the one who should have protected you better." Annie watched her brother's shoulders relax slightly, the first time in months. There would be hard days ahead, she knew. Recovery wouldn't be instant or easy. But the truth was out now, and with it came the possibility of healing. As night fell, their dad got a call from the detective. More families were coming forward across the state. Rose's web of manipulation was unraveling fast. Each new revelation hurt, but each one also meant another victim who wouldn't have to carry the burden alone anymore. "We're going to get through this," their dad said after hanging up. "Together. No more secrets in this family." Annie looked at the empty spots where Rose's photos used to hang, at the spaces she tried to fill with her fake, perfect stepmom act. Those spaces could heal now, could become something real again. It would take time, but they had that now. They had the truth. 3 months had passed since the truth came out. The leaves had changed and fallen, and the first snow of winter dusted the ground outside the courthouse. Annie sat between her dad and Tom on the hard wooden bench, waiting for Rose's sentencing hearing to begin. More victims had come forward over the past months, 15 in total, spanning 5 years and 3 states. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same: manipulation, threats, destroyed trust. The prosecution had built a strong case, backed by evidence from phones, computers, and witness statements. Tom hadn't wanted to testify at first. "I can't face her," he'd said during one of their family therapy sessions. But after hearing other victims speak up, something changed in him. "If I stay quiet, she wins," he decided. Now, watching her brother straighten his tie before heading to the witness stand, Annie felt a surge of pride. His voice shook at first, but grew stronger as he told his story. He didn't look at Rose once. Their dad reached for Annie's hand when Tom described how Rose had isolated him from his family and friends. His grip tightened when Tom talked about the shame and fear he'd lived with. But he didn't look away. He promised them both he would never turn away from hard truths again. During a break in the proceedings, Andy, one of the other victims from Rose's most recent school, approached them in the hallway. "Your sister saved us all," he told Tom quietly. If she hadn't started digging, hadn't spoken up. Tom managed a small smile. "She's pretty amazing like that." The prosecutor presented evidence of Rose's pattern of behavior, the name changes, the move between schools, the careful grooming of vulnerable students. Reading through old social media messages, Annie recognized the same phrases Rose had used with Tom. "You're so mature for your age. No one else understands me like you do. This is our special secret." When Rose's lawyer tried to paint her as a troubled woman who needed help rather than punishment, the judge wasn't swayed. "The systematic nature of your actions shows clear premeditation," she said. "You used your position of trust to prey on young people in your care." The sentence came down heavy: 15 years in prison, no possibility of early release. Rose would have to register as an offender, could never work with young people again. As the judge listed the terms, Annie watched the perfect stepmom mask finally crack completely. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered with their cameras and microphones. Their dad had prepared a statement with help from their lawyer. "Today, justice was served not just for my son, but for all the young people who suffered in silence. To anyone else out there being manipulated or abused, speak up. There are people who will believe you, who will help you. You are not alone." That evening, they ordered Chinese food and ate it in the living room, something Rose would never have allowed. Their dad had taken a month off work to focus on their family healing. He'd even started learning to cook, though so far they'd had more burned attempts than successes. "I got accepted to State University," Tom announced suddenly, between bites of lo mein. "Full scholarship for debate team." Annie dropped her chopsticks. "What? When were you going to tell us?" "Just got the email during the court break. I wasn't sure I wanted to go to college at all, after everything. But my therapist says I can't let what happened stop me from living my life." Their dad wiped his eyes with his napkin. "I'm so proud of you, son. Both of you. You've shown such strength." Later, Annie found Tom in the backyard, shooting hoops like he used to. The old basketball hoop their dad had installed years ago squeaked with each shot, but Tom didn't seem to mind. "You know what the best part is?" he said as Annie joined him. "I don't feel afraid anymore. When I think about college, about the future, I'm actually excited." "You deserve to be excited," Annie said, stealing the ball and attempting a shot. It missed completely, making them both laugh. A real laugh, not the forced ones they'd been using for months. Inside, they could hear their dad on the phone with their aunt, planning Thanksgiving dinner. The house felt lighter now, cleaner somehow, like a fever had finally broken. The local support group for families affected by abuse had asked Tom to speak at their next meeting. He'd been hesitant at first, but Annie had seen him working on his speech, crossing out and rewriting, determined to help others find their voice. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, they stayed outside shooting hoops and talking about normal things, college plans, what movies they wanted to see, whether their dad would ever learn to cook without setting off the smoke alarm. The past couldn't be changed, but it no longer had the power to control their future. They were healing, one day at a time as a family. And that, Annie realized, was the greatest victory of all. 1 year later, the garden was in full bloom. Annie stood at the kitchen window, watching her dad attempt to grill burgers for Tom's graduation party. He'd finally mastered the basics of cooking, though they still ordered takeout more often than not. The backyard was filled with balloons and streamers, and a congratulations graduate banner hung between 2 trees. Tom's debate team friends were playing an impromptu basketball tournament, their laughter carrying through the open windows. "Need help with those cupcakes?" Tom asked, coming into the kitchen. He was taller now, standing straighter. The haunted look in his eyes had faded, replaced by something stronger. "You're supposed to be enjoying your party," Annie said, but smiled as he grabbed a mixing bowl anyway. They worked together in comfortable silence, frosting cupcakes and arranging them on the display stand their aunt had brought over. "I got another letter today," Tom said quietly, "from a kid at the support group. Said my speech helped him tell his parents about his coach." Annie nodded. After Tom had spoken at the support group, he'd become something of a mentor to other survivors. His story had been featured in a documentary about abuse in schools, though they'd kept his identity private. The documentary had led to new laws being passed about background checks and reporting requirements. "You know," Tom said, carefully placing rainbow sprinkles on a cupcake, "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Standing up to her, speaking out, helping others. "It all started because you were brave enough to notice something was wrong and do something about it." "We did it together," Annie corrected him. "That's what family does." Outside, their dad had managed to burn only 2 burgers this time, a new record. He changed 2 over the past year. He worked fewer hours at the hospital, made it to all of Annie's choir concerts and Tom's debate competitions. They had weekly family dinners where they actually talked to each other, sharing their lives instead of just existing in the same space. The doorbell rang, more guests arriving. This time it was Andy and his mom. After the trial, their families had grown close, supporting each other through the healing process. Andy was starting college too, planning to study psychology to help other trauma survivors. "The guest of honor is hiding in the kitchen," Andy called out, making Tom laugh and throw a sprinkle at him. The afternoon passed in a blur of food, games, and celebration. Tom's debate team surprised him with a video montage of their competition highlights. Their dad gave a speech that made everyone cry happy tears. Even their usually serious aunt was caught dancing when someone started playing music. As the sun began to set, Annie found herself sitting on the old wooden bench with Tom. They watched their dad attempt to learn some TikTok dance the debate team kids were teaching him, both trying not to laugh too hard. "I had a dream about her last night," Tom said suddenly. First one in months. Annie waited, letting him continue at his own pace. But it was different this time. In the dream, I wasn't scared of her anymore. I just felt sorry for her. Sorry that she was so broken she had to hurt others to feel powerful. "That's because you're healing," Annie said. "Our therapist says that's what healing looks like, when the person who hurt you loses their power over your thoughts." Tom nodded, watching the party continue around them. "You know what's weird? I'm actually grateful, in a way. Not for what she did," he added quickly, "but for what came after. Dad becoming more present, us getting closer as a family, being able to help other people. We turned something ugly into something meaningful," Annie agreed. Their dad called them over for the cake-cutting ceremony. As they sang congratulations, and Tom blew out the candles, Annie looked around at their gathering. There was so much love here, so much support. They'd rebuilt their family stronger than before. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and they were cleaning up the backyard, their dad pulled them both into a hug. "I know this past year hasn't been easy," he said, but watching you both grow, seeing how you've turned pain into purpose, I've never been more proud to be your father." Tom was leaving for college in 2 months. Annie would start her senior year of high school. Their dad was dating again, carefully this time, with full background checks and family dinner introductions. Life was moving forward. That night, Annie updated her diary, not the one full of evidence and secrets, but a new one she'd started for recording happy memories. She wrote about the party, about Tom's plans for college, about their dad's horrible dance moves. At the end, she added, "Sometimes the worst things in life lead us to the strongest versions of ourselves. We're not just survivors anymore, we're warriors. And warriors keep fighting, not just for themselves, but for everyone else still finding their voice." She closed the diary and looked out her window at the stars. The same stars that had witnessed their darkest moments now shone on their triumph. They had turned their story of pain into one of hope, their tragedy into strength. And somewhere out there, another person would read their story and find the courage to speak up, to seek help, to believe in healing. That was the real victory, not just surviving, but showing others they could survive too. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities and free from shadows. They were ready for whatever came next because they would face it together as a family.